So we're in a commune in Guangxi province. There's a team right now. There was a call yesterday into the hotline that said that there was some kind of unexploded ordnance found in this commune. We're with the team that's trying to figure out what it is before they decide how to detonate it, how to get rid of it.
Với cấu trúc của đội chúng tôi cũng có 7 thành viên, trong đó có một đội trưởng, một đội phó, một nhân viên y tế và 4 nhân viên kỹ thuật.
I'm here with a translator, and she says the team has 7 team members, 1 team leader, a deputy leader, a medical staff member, and 4 deminers.
This is Rebecca Tan, the Post Southeast Asia bureau chief. She's with a group of deminers during a recent trip to Vietnam. These are people with a dangerous task. They respond to community reports of munitions and unexploded bombs from the Vietnam War. These bombs are still all over the region, even though the war ended 50 years ago. And what these deminers do is find those explosives and destroy them. Because they're still live, they can kill people.
So I'm walking through a field to where the munition was spotted, which was at the bottom of a tree. So we're just approaching, I think. What is the site? Let's see. Is that it? Yeah. Oh, nice. So the head of operations leads us over to where the munition is found. And basically tells us that it's a rifle grenade.
Oh, okay. Oh, okay.
Some of the crew stay there and remove that grenade, which is being brought back to the demolition center to be destroyed.
Yeah.
In the meantime, we head out with another team who has found a cluster munition in the middle of a field, and that can't be moved. It has to be destroyed on site. They have indiscriminate weapons. They'll kill everything around it, basically. So they have to be destroyed where they're found. So they build a little mound around the cluster munition, and they surround it with their own explosives. And then they fan out in 5 different directions. They say, hello, hello. And they give out warnings. They warn people that an explosion's about to happen. So we back up about 200 meters away and are set up next to the detonator, basically. And he begins to count us down. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2,
1. Điểm hỏa ngay bây giờ. Nổ!
You know, the process of getting rid of all of them, it's so laborious, it's so difficult. And, you know, talking to the deminers, it'll take 10 years more to even remotely make the province safe. So these weapons, these remnants of war are very much present.
Today, April 30th, represents an important moment in history. On this day, 50 years ago, the U.S. war in Vietnam ended. It was a war that left more than 3 million Vietnamese dead and killed more than 50,000 U.S. service members. The emotional and physical reminders of the war are still present all across Vietnam, from unexploded munitions like the ones Rebecca encountered to the residual effects of lethal chemicals like Agent Orange. According to Vietnamese authorities, there are more than 300,000 Vietnamese soldiers whose remains are still missing, and some 1,200 U.S. soldiers are still unaccounted for. Addressing these legacies has become a massive binational effort by the U.S. and Vietnam in the decades since the war, and Rebecca says it's helped build peace and trust. That is, until this year, when funding cuts from the Trump administration changed everything.
To put it succinctly, these efforts have been upended. There's a whole host of bilateral cooperation between the U.S. and Vietnam, areas that, the two countries weren't able to work on closely together for many, many years. Those efforts have just been dropped entirely. It's a very complicated picture, but the overarching impact has been one of chaos.
From the newsroom of The Washington Post, this is Post Reports. I'm Colby Ickowitz. It's Wednesday, April 30th. Today, the fraying of Vietnam and U.S. relations 50 years after the end of the war. Rebecca, hi. Thanks for joining me.
Hello.
So, Rebecca, April 30th, it's an important day in the legacy of the Vietnam War. Tell us what was going on 50 years ago on that date. What happened at the end of the war?
So on April 30th, 1975, that's when the North Vietnamese army, or what the Americans at the time called the Viet Cong, made their final push to capture the city of Saigon in South Vietnam. This triggered the panicked evacuation of thousands of U.S. personnel on American warplanes and the collapse of the South Vietnamese government.
Saigon, April the 30th, 8 o'clock. The last American helicopter on the roof of the American embassy prepares to lift off the last of the evacuees fleeing before the advancing communist armies. Hundreds scrambled in panic onto any boats they could reach, not caring how they got aboard or what they left behind.
It marked for what, many today see as the end of the Vietnam War, which lasted 20 years, and which was about a lot of things, but was rooted chiefly in this question of ideology, in this belief, now denounced by a lot of people, of the need for containment, that if Vietnam was allowed to become communist, it would trigger this series of events, this contagion, that would eventually threaten America's ability to be democratic. And what, a lot of people now say was a needless war, was a war that was based on a false premise. In the U.S., the Vietnam War was a major political issue for 2 decades. In Vietnam, both North Vietnam and South Vietnam, it was hugely devastating.
Civilian deaths approached 2 million.
Civilians paid the highest price. Nearly 2 million of them were killed across Vietnam.
We're talking about women, children, entire communities that were absolutely wiped out.
The U.S. military sprayed millions of hectares in Vietnam with Agent Orange, a defoliant that turns thick jungle into barren wasteland.
So, Rebecca, you recently visited Vietnam on a reporting trip. Tell us why you went there.
So, we were approaching the 50th anniversary of the end of the war, which is, a hugely consequential point for Vietnam, for the U.S., for the bilateral relationship. But apart from that, or I guess around that, there's also just been a lot going on in Vietnam. Trump's dismantling of USAID, of the U.S. Institute of Peace, these have had huge ripple effects on Vietnam because of the joint work on war legacies. His trade decisions, his trade war has also had huge repercussions in Vietnam. In the last 30 years, Vietnam has created this highly export-reliant economy, largely in response to American coaxing. But that model of trade is now kind of existentially threatened by Trump's trade war. You see, all of this is happening and swirling as the country readies itself to remember 50 years since the end of the war. In Vietnam, even though, this war is 50 years ago, it's hard to find people who don't have some kind of connection to the war. They had a grandfather, an uncle, a neighbor who fought in the war. But I also met a lot of Vietnamese veterans, and I spoke to a lot of Vietnamese veterans who fought directly in the war, who are now in their 70s or 80s. And I think this is something that people forget as well. 50 years ago, yes, it's a long time, but the people who fought in that war are still very much alive.
I was hoping you could tell us about some of the people that you met and how people who lived through the war kind of remember and process it today?
So I spent one afternoon in Hanoi with a retired general, Hong Kan Hong, who's also the chair of the Vietnam Martyr Family Support Association, which is a group of several thousand volunteers who support the families of those who were killed in the war, and who try to find the remains of those still missing.
Does he mind if I ask him how old are you?
Cô ơi xin phép hỏi tuổi bác được không?
And I spoke to him through an interpreter.
Năm nay sinh năm 1948.
He was born in 1948.
Born in 1948.
So General Hong, he's 77 now, and he was 17 when he joined the Vietnamese Army in 1965.
Wow.
He's got a full head of white hair. He's an old guy, but he's extremely sprightly, energetic. He spends all his time traveling Vietnam, trying to raise funds for his association, and he feels very motivated.
Chúng tôi thành lập ra hội này là vì tình cảm với những người đã chết.
We founded this association because of our emotion, our responsibility with the fallen soldiers.
We talked for a long time, and the word that kept coming up was, he felt haunted by the people that he saw who had been killed on the battlefield, his comrades, his brothers, he called them. There are, some 300,000 or so Vietnamese soldiers who are unaccounted for, who've never been found. Their remains are somewhere across the country, presumably, but, they've never been located. Just, in the past couple of years, some mass graves have been uncovered. People are using DNA technology to try to identify their relatives. This work, and then the anniversary for a lot of people, it's brought to the surface these very painful memories from 50 years ago. Vietnam for a long time focused on developing itself, on building its economy. It couldn't really afford to grieve, if that makes sense. But I felt, while I was there, that now, there's a sense in opening, for some of that grief to come out.
Yeah, for people who lost loved ones during the war, I imagine continuing to look for the remains of their loved ones is a way to kind of process that grief.
Like I said, it's very slow, painstaking work. It's trying to triangulate information from 50 years ago, trying to find out who was the last person to see their brother, where they were, how they died. Everyone that I talked to who was involved in this work talked about this concept of coming home, that the souls are, forever wandering the land unless the remains can be recovered and given a proper burial. And it's not just the Vietnamese who feel this way, that they're relatives of American soldiers who feel this lack of closure, this lack of resolution as well.
How long have these kind of searches been going on? And who's kind of who's funding these efforts?
So the search for American soldiers has actually predates the search for Vietnamese soldiers. Even before U.S. and Vietnam had diplomatic relations, had a commercial relationship, America had asked the Vietnamese government, communist government, to help find its soldiers who were killed in the war. So this was in, the early 1990s. And only more recently has there been an effort, I guess, to find the Vietnamese soldiers who went missing. And this is in part because of a lot of volunteer organizations, Vietnamese volunteer organizations, who've then received the help of what used to be the U.S. Institute of Peace, which is a congressionally funded think tank and advocacy group that focuses on fostering peace in places of conflict. But it picked up this effort, I want to say from 5 or 6 years ago, and they did so by connecting these Vietnamese groups to American veterans, to American archives. They flew American veterans out to Vietnam so that they could pinpoint these were where we buried the bodies, basically.
Wow.
And that work, again, it's slow, it's painstaking, but there was progress that was being made.
And Rebecca, when you were there, did you talk to anyone from the U.S. who's actively looking for family members?
While I was in Vietnam, I managed to connect with this guy, Steve Morrissey, from Sun City, Arizona.
My father was a career Air Force officer, went to Vietnam 3 times. And on the 7th of November, 1972, his aircraft was left on a single aircraft strike mission in southern North Vietnam and never returned.
He was in Vietnam in April to try to find the site where his father, who was in the American Air Force, he was shot down in 1972. He was there with the help of USIP. USIP had helped him organize this search, basically. His mother had passed away a couple years ago, and he wanted to place his mother's ashes at the crash site to reunite his parents.
I know that at one moment when I was there, I wept a little bit, and I felt like I was saying to my dad, I brought her here. I brought her back to you. I brought you to Dad.
It was this deeply meaningful experience for him, as he said. He got to see, maps and recognize his father's handwriting. He went to the bridge where he could kind of see in his mind's eye where the plane went down and where he lost his father, and he was able to have a little ceremony there.
It all came together in such a way that I felt like I understood what happened to my dad.
But he, described it as a kind of bittersweet moment because he might be one of the last families able to do that because it's been, dissolved basically by the Trump administration.
The United States is a great nation. Right? We're the wealthiest and at least we claim to be the most powerful nation on earth. And it just seems so small and mean-spirited. We've had this amazing experience, this healing experience that no other agency, this is what they're here for, is person-to-person diplomacy, reconciliation.
After the break, Rebecca and I talk about how the U.S. and Vietnam built back trust in diplomatic relations after the war, and how those decades-long efforts are falling apart. We'll be right back.
My name is Jason Rezaian, and I am the director of press freedom initiatives here at the Washington Post. May 3rd is World Press Freedom Day. Back in 2014, when I was the Tehran bureau chief for the Washington Post, my wife and I were arrested from our home. I was held for 544 days, almost a year and a half. From the very first moments after my arrest, the Post was involved in trying to secure my release. Every day, journalists defend our democracy by holding power to account. My job is now to stand up for the rights of journalists in the United States and around the world, and especially those journalists who've had their voices silenced. I know what it is to lose a day, or 544 of them, of my life for the work that I do, and I don't want anybody else to suffer that fate. When you subscribe to the Washington Post, you support this kind of work. Learn more at washingtonpost.com/subscribe. I'm Jason Rezaian, and I'm one of the people behind the Post.
Rebecca, let's take a step back and talk about how, the U.S. and Vietnam, after, such a devastating war, were able to then kind of come together, to work together, to find people, to demine bombs, and kind of reconcile this really horrific past. How did that happen?
This took decades of trust building. When the U.S. first normalized relations with Vietnam in 1995, almost immediately after, the first things that the two countries were willing to work with each other on was war legacies. Some of this was out of necessity. For Vietnam, for example, the first place they accepted international help and permanent international presence was in Quang Tri, the province that I was in. And that's because that province in central Vietnam was so riddled with unexploded American bombs. There were literally hundreds of people dying every year from these unexploded munitions. It was like the war had never ended there, right? And they needed the help. And so that's where the first kind of formulations of U.S. Vietnam cooperation emerged, right? And the same with the U.S. It in the 1990s, it was facing a lot of pressure domestically to do more to find the missing American soldiers, and they had to ask the Vietnamese authorities for help. So in order to kind of repair from the war, the two countries had to work together, and that cooperation is the basis of the bilateral relationship that we see today.
What other kind of programs came out of these relations being restored?
So there's the demining that started in the 1990s. There was dioxin removal, and that's the removal of these very toxic dioxins left behind by chemical agents like Agent Orange. This really only began under Obama, so it's fairly recent. There's support for the victims of Agent Orange, for the people who have disabilities because of, the use of that chemical agent. And then there's the search for the missing soldiers. As this kind of cooperation grew, though, on war legacies, the two countries have been able to work on other things together, on public health, on infectious diseases, on climate, on tech. In 1995, when diplomatic relations were restored, the U.S. also lifted a trade embargo in Vietnam. And since then, there's been really a flourishing commercial relationship. And, as recently as last year, I guess if you spoke to someone in December 2024, they would say that the U.S. Vietnam relationship has never been stronger than it was at that point.
That all kind of brings us to today. President Donald Trump takes office, and immediately his administration has kind of slashed the federal government, especially foreign aid. How has that affected the U.S. Vietnam relationships that we've been talking about?
The impact has been, hugely consequential in Vietnam. I spoke to over a dozen USAID officials and contractors who work in Vietnam. USAID, of course, is the United States Agency for International Development. And before it was dismantled by the Trump administration, it had a huge presence here in Vietnam, working on health and climate, but chiefly working on addressing those legacies of war. And I was able to review some documents as well about their work in Vietnam. So at least 34 of 43 USAID contracts with Vietnam have been dropped entirely. And there were 100 or so USAID employees, a mix of staff and contractors who have all been terminated. There were, for example, 2 programs that were started immediately after COVID, to try to stop the spread of infectious diseases from animals to humans. Those programs have been ended. And then there are the efforts to address the after effects of the war, right? We've talked about some of it already. The demining, the cleanup of toxic chemicals, the search for the remains of Vietnamese soldiers. Those have all been thrown into uncertainty as well.
So what do we know about the status of those programs? Can you explain the limbo that they're in right now?
It's a bit of a complicated picture. So the dioxin cleanup at a former American airbase, Bien Hoa Air Base, this is a huge project that was started in 2019, $465 million or so. It was given supposedly one of the waivers to continue operations. But we spoke to USAID officials who said that in actuality, progress on this is still stalled because Washington won't approve the release of funding to a contractor who needs to build a treatment plant for this toxic soil. So this is kind of extremely dangerous because this contaminated soil has already been disturbed. It's already been excavated, and it needs to be treated before, the arrival of the monsoon season, the rainy season in Vietnam. The risk there being, the toxins could go into the water, which then leads to a river that passes through Ho Chi Minh. On the demining, right, it was forced to stop for a month, then supposedly given a waiver as the Trump administration does this review of aid programs. But the deadline for that review has come and gone without any official verdict. And the demining groups, the mine action groups, they say they need at least 10 years more of funding at current levels just to make this one province, Quang Tri, livable.
So you said the administration had reviewed some of these programs and offered waivers. I mean, has the cuts across the federal government have been fairly indiscriminate. Mm-hmm. Has anyone in the administration talked about why it decided to do this, or kind of have they understood the cost of what it means for Vietnam to have some of these programs slashed?
I don't think so. I mean, like, the Trump administration hasn't addressed the cuts in Vietnam specifically. Broadly, they've said that they're a burden to the American taxpayer. It's not something the U.S. should be paying for. The issue with Vietnam is that, that's quite complicated because of the U.S. role here. These munitions, these chemicals, they were left behind by the American military. The missing mass graves were dug by American soldiers. So I think the question of, U.S. responsibility and involvement, it's a little bit more complicated in Vietnam than it might be somewhere else.
And what about, you mentioned trade relations. Obviously, Trump has proposed these across-the-board tariffs. How is the normalization of trade relations being, which was such a turning point for Vietnam and U.S. 30 years ago, how has that changed now?
So when Trump initially issued his list of tariffs, he proposed 46% on Vietnam, which is one of the highest tariff rates for any country. And this was really received with shock and a sense of betrayal in Vietnam. There was a sense that, the commercial relationship, the official relationship between the two countries had gotten so good that, a tariff rate of 46% kind of wasn't possible. A lot of what was made in China moved to being produced in Vietnam during Trump's first trade war. And so it's actually since 2016 that trade relationship has grown exponentially.
And Rebecca, you mentioned that, a sense of betrayal over this 46% tariff on goods from Vietnam. Is there also a sense of betrayal that they would abandon some of these programs that were going to help clean up and reconcile from the war?
Officially, Vietnam's government has been pretty muted on what they think about the aid cuts. They've expressed objection, but they've held back. And that's because they're in these negotiations for a trade deal, which they really need. It's kind of a question of survival for the economy. But in private conversations that I had with official advisors to the Vietnamese government, they said the Trump administration has managed in 4 months to generate a level of distrust toward the U.S. that has not been seen in Vietnam in a really long time. There are questions about whether it's possible to continue on that path of, on that long arc of reconciliation.
Has anyone taken this on as an issue and kind of pushed back on the Trump administration and said, no, these programs are really important to a relationship that we've built over the last several decades with Vietnam?
So there's been some objection among, Democratic legislators, but really the voice, that would have been the biggest kind of opponent to it is Senator Patrick Leahy, who is retired. He is a retired Democratic senator from Vermont who championed reconciliation with Vietnam. And he was the last senator to serve through the 1970s when he retired in 2023. So I called him, and I could hear in his voice how kind of aghast he was. He told me that he thinks Trump is making a colossal mistake and that Trump, quote, threatens to sabotage 30 years of cooperation with a key partner. Another person that I spoke to, her name is Susan Hammond. She's the daughter of a U.S. Vietnam War veteran. She's dedicated her life to humanitarian work in Vietnam. She told me, she felt like her heart was breaking for all the progress that had been made that was now being eroded in the span of a couple months, a couple weeks.
Yeah, Rebecca, given this new backdrop with Trump in office and making all of these changes and this really important anniversary, the 50th anniversary of the end of this devastating war, how are people kind of making sense of those two things happening at once, right? Marking the end of the war 50 years ago, but also having to reconcile the fact that the U.S. is suddenly making things harder.
I think it's, this feeling of a huge shame. There's a sense of irony to it, certainly, as well. A lot of the programs that we talked about, they were expanded in anticipation of the 50th year anniversary. Maybe a particularly poignant symbol of the state that we're in right now. There was meant to be this joint first-of-its-kind exhibition at the War Remnants Museum in Ho Chi Minh City to mark the 30th anniversary of the normalization of relations. And if you've been to this museum in Ho Chi Minh City, it's basically a display of American atrocities. And so there had been this effort on the side of both the U.S. and Vietnam to make a new exhibit that would, bring the story forward, that would tell the story of cooperation and repairing the consequences of war. It was, a great opportunity for the U.S. to kind of update its image, right? But that exhibition has been left in indefinite limbo because the USAID and the USIP officials who were in charge of it are no longer allowed to work. They've all lost their jobs.
So, Rebecca, what is your takeaway from all this? What does the future hold for relations between these two countries?
So, Vietnam is very pragmatic. Its government is, its people are. It will keep negotiating with the Trump administration. It will try to get the best deal possible on trade. It's approved for the Trump Organization to build a golf course in central Vietnam. It's approved for Elon Musk to expand Starlink operations in Vietnam. They'll do, what they think will help. And the country has certainly also been through more turbulent periods of history than this. But there is something lost, qualitatively in the relationship between the two countries. There was an analyst I spoke to from the International Crisis Group, Hoang Le Thu, and she put it like this. She said, the relationship will become more transactional. It'll be about what I can get from you, what you can get from me. The sincerity that existed for a few decades will kind of be lost. The sincerity of, President Obama and Anthony Bourdain eating noodles on the side of the street, that sincerity will be lost. And overall, the relationship will become, quote unquote, shallower.
Rebecca, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Rebecca Tan is the Post's Southeast Asia bureau chief. That's it for Post Reports. Thanks for listening. Today's episode was produced by Alana Gordon. It was mixed by Sam Baer. It was edited by Lucy Perkins with help from Maggie Penman. Thank you to Peter Finn and Emma Talkoff. I'm Colby Yerkowitz. We'll be back tomorrow with more stories from The Washington Post.